Welcome to session 6, everyone. The old ethic and the new ethic, and the true cost of not knowing how to emotionally process your pain. I'm going to share my screen and we are going to get right into it. So this is an incredible book. It's called Depth Psychology and a New Ethic. Erich Neumann was basically the capstone individual of Jungian psychology. I kind of think of him as the golden capstone of that entire field. He wrote books that, Jung wanted to have written, specifically this small book, Depth Psychology and New Ethic, which was absolutely groundbreaking and should have won the Nobel Peace Prize. And he also wrote The Origins and History of Consciousness, which was a kind of seminal, iconic work that you really would have assumed Jung might have written, but he didn't. And Erich Neumann, of course, is much lesser well known than Jung, but just an absolute towering genius when it came to understanding the psyche. And so whenever I'm teaching my transdisciplinary healer course, I do recommend this book. It's quite small, and he does repeat himself. And you don't have to read it if you're watching this, because I'm going to explain it very clearly. The book should actually be called Depth Psychology and the Old Ethic, because he spends the entire book talking about the old ethic, and he doesn't actually give details around what the new ethic is. This course is all about the new ethic. What I have been talking to you about is the new ethic that he does not go into detail about. He simply identifies the old ethic and says some of the things that are, obviously wrong with it, and then gives a kind of a general direction that we have to go into, which is to the basic 4 fundamental elements of the old ethic. So let's just get really, really clear. What is the old ethic? What are we talking about here? The old ethic, according to Neumann, and of course I agree with, is how we have historically dealt with our pain, our emotional pain, period. Like, how do we deal with emotional pain historically? Well, for thousands of years, we've literally done 4 things, and there they are. We've suppressed it, we've repressed it, and I will explain the distinction between the two, and then we projected it onto someone else, onto something else, and we've scapegoated people. And of course, if some of you, will recall from the early days of, tribal life, the scapegoat was a very common thing, whether it was the village idiot or, the individual on the spectrum, or sometimes even, it's true, the oddity, the trans person, if they were not, given the hallowed role that they should be given as someone who has a new and, different and therefore beneficial perspective on life, on the tribe, on nature, on the stars, then oftentimes they would be scapegoated as, who was different, someone who was different. And if it wasn't an individual, it was actually a goat. And what would happen was that periodically, maybe once a year, all of the sins of the tribe would be placed onto this individual or onto the goat, and they would be exiled into the wilderness. And of course, they would die. And this was a very magical phenomenon. You can't actually project the sins of yourself onto someone else, and that's why it keeps having to be done, and it has no end. But the point of it is that it's a complete sidestepping of emotional processing. And of course, we can understand that because, many tribal, traditional, and indigenous people of that time, they didn't have these technologies online. They just weren't necessarily there. There were perhaps some ways in which we were doing them with shamans and certain healing techniques, but the general way that we dealt with existential angst and certainly trauma and emotional pain was that we suppressed it, we repressed it, and we projected it, period, right? And this is what Neumann talks about. The difference between suppression and repression is that with repression, you're actually not aware that you're dissociating from your pain. It's happening automatically. The content that you're dealing with is too disturbing, and it simply gets sucked or recessed into the unconscious, and you have no idea. So these are certain individuals you might meet in your life, and it might be very clear that they're extremely traumatized, and if you ever ask them about it, they would say, I'm absolutely fine. I mean, they have no idea that they're traumatized. They have no idea that it has been repressed within them. And the only way that you will see that is because they act out in certain ways, right? And this is what this is all about, is the fact that all of this traumatic junk that we push either consciously or unconsciously into our unconscious, right? It has to do something. And for years, I would use the metaphor to people who would, come to my office and start this work for the first time. I would sometimes explain something, which is that I would give an analogy that, all of our emotional pain that gets built up, essentially what we're doing and what we're doing with these inner children of ours is that we're dumping them in the basement of our house. We're dumping our woundings. We're dumping our jealousy, our anger, our hatred, our vitriol, certain aspects of our own sexuality that are, improper for the culture. Whatever you want, we are repressing that and pushing it into the unconscious. And we're filling up the unconscious. The unconscious actually is a finite resource, right? There's not an infinite amount of it. And at some point, that basement within us gets filled up. And I used to say, listen, your inner children at some point, you can throw them into the basement and put an old dirty tarp over them and hold it down with bricks. But at some point, it starts to smell in the living room and in the kitchen and in the bedroom and in the front yard. And, people seem to really understand that metaphor, which is that you can't hide from your pain indefinitely. At some point, it starts to act out in your life, either in behavior or in moods, chronic depression, certain moods that just begin to grab you and refuse to go away. And you say to yourself, what's going on? What's going on? Well, a lot of the time, if not, in my opinion, most of the time, this is the backlog and the final effects of repressing pain inside of yourself indefinitely, right? And I'm going to make a connection here. This particular module, I'm going to show you what this is and how this works at the individual level. Then I'm going to take it to the family level, and then I'm going to take it to the world. And I am ultimately trying to make a kind of subtle comparison that this old ethic of suppression, repression, projection is actually in lockstep with our reliance on fossil fuels. It's the same thing. We're relying on a finite resource that has enormous collateral damage, and that it actually has tremendous implications for the environment and for the weakest among us. And I want you to see that there's a painful, dark thread that goes from the individual to the couple to the family and to the world, to the macroeconomic world that we see that is so destructive and disastrous to Mother Earth and to others and to her children. I mean, you could just expand it as much as you want. So let's get really, really clear, right? You get hurt, you dissociate, you blame someone else. You project it onto your partner. Your father gets hurt, he associates, he acts out with his children and his mother or his father or his whoever, his neighbor. A business off-gasses, it hides, it blames a minority stakeholder. This is the beginning of what I'm going to explain to you. So let's go through in the psyche, in the couple, in the family, in the world. Although I'm not going to do the couple, I'm actually just going to go psyche, family, world. So here, this diagram, we're going to approach it again. Trauma splits you in three. You plus trauma equals you plus an exiled inner child and a primitive defense. The exiled inner child is the part of you. There's a certain exuberance, a certain joy, a certain creativity, a certain freedom. It's actually a freedom of expression, a freedom of behavior that as a result of trauma is completely curtailed and repressed. Oh, and that was a little detail that I didn't mention. The difference between repression and suppression is when repression is it's completely unconscious. It's been shunted into the unconscious. We have no idea we're doing it. Suppression is where it's slightly conscious and you're consciously, willfully attempting to push down the pain, right? So, anyone who kind of comes home after a day's work and, drinks half a bottle of wine, that's suppression. Like, you're aware that you're actually going through something and you are willfully suppressing that with alcohol. And of course, the greatest suppression, I think, today is probably emotional eating, right? Eating food, I think that has something to do with the rise in celebrity chefs and cooking shows, because our easiest, our least expensive, our most available way of suppressing and repressing our trauma is through food. And that's why whenever you see individuals, with ginormous guts, and this is not a judgment whatsoever, but you can put your money on the fact that there's a huge amount of trauma there that is being held down, and oftentimes it's unconscious, right? And so that's the difference between repression and suppression. It's really just a question of consciousness, of how conscious are we of it. When it becomes suppressed, when we are suppressing it, we're more conscious of the fact that the pain is there. When it's repressed, we have no awareness of that. And so that's a question also of readiness. When someone is extremely repressed, their readiness is they're further away from being ready to doing this work. You don't bring this work to someone who's completely unconscious of their pain and their trauma. It's not their time. So you plus trauma equals an exiled inner child, a part of you that is good. The treasure is sheared off of you. It's dumped into the unconscious, and it gives birth to a primitive defense. Okay, we know this. But all of this is unconscious. And what's usually conscious is you plus the trauma equals you angry with whatever hurt you and whoever or whatever aligns with whatever hurt you, right? That's usually what's more conscious. And there you have already the sleight of hand of the old ethic, right? It's an immediate repression. We're not aware that there's an element to be healed, such as the inner child, and we simply enter into this victim-perpetrator loop. We've been hurt, and there's a problem out there in the world, and we have to solve it. So now you return to the world, and you have this little dynamic in place, and whatever reminds your amygdala of the event triggers the Medusa archetype, right? Or the Kronos archetype, if you want to masculinize it. And so here we have the anger and the projection. And I'm going to attempt to offer the nuance here, is that, like, yes, there are things in the world that are for want of a better term, immoral, unethical, even perhaps evil. Certainly Jung used that term. I think there are individuals out there who are beyond the pale. I'm sure individuals who I've worked with who are part of the military will say that with a very straight face, and I believe them, actually. There are some who have actually gone completely to the other side, and we have to be aware of that. Regardless, my point is that what you will find is that your need and your desire to project will suddenly skyrocket following trauma, right? And even if you find a correct target to project that anger upon, the issue here, as you can see what I'm trying to do here, is I'm trying to make a connection that you will be ignoring usually the healing of the inner child, and you will go right to the externalized threat, and you will attempt to solve the entire equation there, not just your healing, but you will try to make the quote unquote world a better place by attacking this individual or this particular group. And so we attack the projection, right? And we ignore what actually needs healing. And that is a very problematic equation within the old ethic that I'm trying to explain to you. Because every attack, whether on a legitimate projection or not, that takes place without healing first, right, will only bring temporary relief to the ego, but ongoing pain to the inner child because it remains exiled and unhealed, right? That's the essence here that is so important. So what also happens is that our attacks on the projections, once again, whether appropriate or not, whether these are actually individuals who we need to exile from our tribe or our world or not, it's not about that. It's the fact that our attacks onto them when we are unhealed will carry with them that unhealed energy to make those attacks disproportionate to the crime, right? I want to be so clear about that. Our counterattacks, our counter injunctions, our attempts to make the world a better place, if it is coming from an unhealed place at that inner child level, will be disproportionately vitriolic, rageful, vengeful. All of the energy that has not been addressed at that inner child level will literally be shouldered onto the projections. And so that unresolved pain will act like a kind of nitroglycerin to catastrophize the perceived threats and excessively and disproportionately counterattack them, which will also make those attacks on the threat less effective and open them up to counter attacks, right? Hopefully that's clear. And of course, all of this is usually unconscious. And what we will usually see is simply an innocent victim striving for a better world, addressing a perpetrator. And all of those other nuances of the old ethic are redacted and unconscious. And the result is that the victims become perpetrators in their own right, and healing actually never happens. And, we see this with Israel and Palestine. We saw this with Cuba and Castro. We see this with any number of individuals who have been hurt and who start organizations. I to some degree feel like this is actually the nonprofit sickness. I've worked with nonprofits all my career. And of course, we know, if you know anything about nonprofits, is there's always an executive director who's burning out. There's always a campaign that is more important than anything else. That's the projection. And everyone's health and well-being is simply marginalized. And so that is a reflection, a ratcheted up reflection of the old ethic at the psychic level, transformed to the organizational level, right? What you're doing is you're marginalizing the actual healing that needs to take place, and you're projecting everything that needs to happen on the goal, no matter what it is. If it's mothers against drunk driving, if it's against abusive husbands, if it's against you name it. It doesn't matter what it is. And I'm not saying that any of those things are wrong. They're all incredibly important missions for our world to become a better place. Absolutely. What I'm saying is that when they are engaged from an unhealed place, there's an enormous amount of off-gassing that takes place and gets burdened onto the mission itself and contaminates the mission itself. So Republicans and Democrats, Israel and Palestinians, English and Irish, women and men. The list could be endless. The disproportionate response. It's when we lose our cool while objecting, perhaps even to something totally legitimate. There are a lot of, family men and women who probably know this, in your house. If your boundaries crossed, and let's say you don't have a voice, and you have unhealed trauma, when your boundaries crossed, you will start to shout to the high heavens, and you'll be in this catch-22 where everyone who's crossed your boundary will say, well, now you're being the abuser because, your bark is totally disproportionate to our offense. And that particular individual, and I've worked with individuals on both sides of that equation, they just so infuriated. And I will say to them, it's because you haven't healed. You haven't healed that inner part. And when we start to heal that inner part, then they can actually hold a boundary that is not with a disproportionate energy. They can just say, hey, you're crossing my boundary. I don't appreciate that. And the whole system can begin to change because they're bringing it with a kind of poise and a kind of cool and a kind of healed, more relaxed space, right? So they're not actually trying to, quote unquote, heal the family system or heal the world at the higher levels, whilst also toxifying it at the same time, because that's what this is all about. It's about bringing appropriate correction to the world, not while carrying in your own toxicity. That's what this is all about. It's like when protests turn into looting. It's a perfect example of it. The legitimacy of the protest is undermined, and the police are brought in, and people who have legitimate grievances because it has gone too far, everything that they're working for can be completely undermined, and they can be counterattacked. Now let's scale this up to the family system. All right, so I'm going to throw in a few other elements that I think are extremely important. So just bear with me. We're going to be cross-training here. The shared family system. There is a shared psycho-emotional space in the family system. I just want to be really clear with that. That's going to take people some time to really grok at the embodied level. But you have to understand you are sharing a psyche. I would love to do a training on this because what it means is, here's a behavioral example. You have like several members in the family. You have to understand there's always going to be some members who are less available to process their shared toxicity and others who are doing more processing. I sometimes see it as it's a shared bank account. And everyone in the family makes deposits and makes withdrawals into that shared bank account. But not everyone makes the same amounts of withdrawals and deposits. In fact, and what are deposits? Deposits are, here's some good energy, I process something. Withdrawals are, I'm taking from the system, right? What you will always find is that some individuals will be taking more from the family system and not withdrawing enough. They're not processing enough stuff. To take it a different way, something I've noticed is that, the more narcissistic members in the family, you can almost see it. It's like the shared family space is like a big gob of toothpaste, and each member is like a toothpaste tube. And the narcissist, they actually refuse to process any emotions. So they kind of push their own toothpaste back into the system. And that toothpaste has to squeeze into the more sensitive members who have less boundaries, usually the empaths. So the narcissist will squeeze their own toothpaste down into the family system, and it will push out literally into the psychic space of the empaths in the system. And the empaths are usually the second child or the last child or the mother. Although that is not a hard and fast rule, but those are trends, and I'm going to get into it. So here's the shared psychic space. There's toxicity in it, and there's also love and good energy if that's the shared bank account. And what we are supposed to do is we're all supposed to do our work. We have to process, which is the new ethic, emotional processing. It's what we didn't have, because otherwise you're going to have to scapegoat someone, which is everywhere in the chronic illness community. There's always a child who's being scapegoated in some way. That's what I've seen for almost 10 years now. As a quick primer on family systems, the first is the first, the oldest, the top dog. They usually follow the party line, the first. Not always, but usually the trend is the first will follow the party line, and they will just kind of carry on. Oftentimes they'll follow in the father's footsteps, perhaps. The second is always kind of the underdog, the rebel, right? And the third or the last will often be the baby and the healer, right? So just a few little brush strokes on that. Totally non-comprehensive, comprehensive, but just at least giving you an idea of it. What often, the stereotype is true. What often happens, and this is because of thousands of years of leaving the tribe and having to go out and fight the wildebeest and bring home the bacon and the meat, the father has a trend of leaving the family system. If you want to see the most common trend that I saw in family systems in the chronic illness world, just look at my ebook, Forbidden to Receive, Compelled to Overgive, and I show you the family constellation that was most common. And it really is, the father has moved out and the mother and the child have been fused, right? So there's a separation and there's a fusion. Those are two things that need to be resolved, each individually in their own way. So what happens is the father goes and he is a little bit outside of the system. He understands how to emotionally process less. He's less developed in his ability to attune to the family. That's because he's a male and because we are experts at dissociation, because that's how we fought and killed wildebeest and brought back food to the table, right? So do not blame us for being massive dissociators, right? That's how we brought food to the tribe. And the mother is an amazing attuner because she's had to help babies to survive. And if you're not attuning to a baby, they're going to die. That's one of those things where it's like, whenever you hear someone say, especially perhaps a woman, please don't beat me up for this one, but when you sometimes hear someone say, a woman say, I really just want him to intuit what I need. That is at a kind of unconscious level, the woman projecting the mother figure onto the partner. Because the only reference point we've ever had for someone who attuned to what we needed before we even knew what we needed was the mother. The mother knows just from the whimper of the child whether it needs to go potty, whether it needs to be fed, whether it needs to be put down, right? So that whenever you hear someone talking about, I just want them, why can't he just know what I want? Why can't he just intuit it? And I'm always laughing and saying, like, stop projecting your mother onto him and teach him, right? We're not magical beings, right? We have to actually learn your patterns first. So don't fall into that role, because you don't want your partner, especially if he's a man, to be your mother. That's going to cause no end of dysfunction in the relationship. Anyway, little aside. So when the father moves off like that, what happens is the shared psycho-emotional space gets stretched, right? He takes on less of the burden. He shirks. We won't justify that or defend it or vilify it, right? But he shirks some of the responsibility of the shared psycho-emotional space. It's the most classic paradigm. It's a stereotype that's true. And as a result of that, the mother has no choice but to take on more of the burden of the shared psycho-emotional space. She has to do that. And so she gets warped in a way because she's having to make, more deposits into the shared bank account and take less withdrawals. And the father's taking more withdrawals. Oftentimes the first son or the first, child will often follow in those footsteps, not always, but often. And what ends up happening is that oftentimes the second, who's really in always a bit of a challenging spot, will have to take on that burden too. They will feel it. And oftentimes it is the second child who has the chronic illness. Not always, once again, it moves around. So don't hold me to that. And so what happens is that over time, because the shared psychic space and the toxicity within it is not being processed equally amongst the participants within the family, this overburdens the mother and it overburdens one of the children. And you can see that. And then sometimes, the third will come in, the healer will come in and try to help things, but it's often never enough. And what will happen is the illness and will ping around. It will bounce off different members. And if you have a real empath within there, I always say there's usually a circuit breaker within a family. That's to say an individual who's actually breaking the pattern. And they often are the biggest empaths. They will often take on the role of the scapegoat. That's the chronic illness individual. I have not necessarily illustrated this here, but more or less, this is what every autoimmune chronic illness family that I have ever seen looks like. So the third child in this case, I guess, is taking on the burden. The mother's trying to help. The second is also in trouble. And what I want to be clear is that original old ethic algorithm of marginalizing the inner child that needs healing and projecting the energy and the goal and the anger and whatever it is outside to something that has to be fixed on the outside world, that is being repeated here at the family level. I want that to be so clear. Right? The father in this particular scenario is focusing outside. It's about the money. I got to make money. I got to do this. It's the business, or it's the politics, and the world is like this, and da, da, da. It's all these projections. Everything's being focused outside, and what's being marginalized is exactly what needs to be healed. And I can tell you right now that this is being repeated at the family level. And if I had done, a quick example at the couple level, you would have seen exactly the same template of this particular diagram in the middle, right? Of the inner child being marginalized. There's a part, the psyche reproduces itself, is what I'm trying to say. It reproduces itself at every level of complexity in life, from the individual to the couple, to the family, to the organization, to the world. And what it does is, just like the Nautilus shell, it repeats its own discrepancies. It repeats its own patterns. And this is one of the big issues, I think, in the world, because everyone is ignoring that inner code. And we're going out to the world and attempting to heal it out there, whilst bringing and repeating and rolling that own discrepancy from our psychic level into the process of trying to heal it. And so we keep getting tripped up on that process. In an ideal world, of course, what would happen is the father would jump in, he would get bigger, the first would get bigger, the mother would start to feel a little bit healed, the third would get healed. The father and the first would really be kings in that particular scenario, and then everyone would be sharing the psychic space and the burdens within it, and there would be a constant flux according to who needed what resources were available at any one time. But more often than not, that doesn't happen. And it's the empaths and the overgivers and the sensitives in the family that have to enact a skillful revolution. And those are usually the people I work with. Sometimes people come to me and they say, "Will you work with my husband?" I'm like, "No, I'm not working with him. I'm working with you. You have to be the expert in this." And so what happens is we have to work on boundaries first and foremost. They have to boundary up. They have to stop giving so much, not in a rude way, but they just have to, they're overgiving. And you have to kind of call that in. Then they have to learn how to metabolize their own inner children. Of course, you have to learn how to do that. And by doing that, you're going to bring more love into that family system immediately off the bat from yourself. And what's going to happen is you're going to start to understand how to access the inner children of those individuals who are not taking their psychic responsibility, right? You can only actually become masterful at calling in those members in the family who are not taking their responsibility once you've done your own work. Because you have to get the terrain. If you don't understand the terrain, they're going to run rings around you. And that's what I've seen a million times. They're just going to talk around you and they're going to argue it out, and you're going to be disempowered. This is every empath within a family system that I've seen like this. You have to train them. You have to train them to be strong and to understand the system, to understand those concentric circles of the trauma anatomy. You have to understand everything we've been talking about. And then what happens is you have to track their patterns. You track the father's patterns because he's avoiding his pain and he's actually waiting for you to actually start the process. It's not him who starts it, it's you that starts it. You're the empath, you're the more sensitive one. That's the big kind of, it's not a joke necessarily, but I laugh eventually because it's always the empaths and the overgivers who are like, why aren't they changing? Why aren't they changing? And I always show up and I say, because it's you who has to go first. So once, mother, the third, the second, once they've understood all this stuff, then that's the key to accessing the father and the first in this particular dynamic, right? And that can then become a kind of carrot that you work with. And perhaps I will do a bonus module on this. I'm not sure if I can go into it just yet, but anyway, you get the point. And once again, the most common family status quo remains. One contingent excessively takes and undergives. They're the less empathic ones, the less emotionally developed, often more damaged, certainly more defended. And they're caught up in the old ethic of suppression, repression, projection loop. And at the other end of the spectrum, right, the mother and the third child in this particular scenario, they're the excessive accommodators and the overgivers. And whether consciously or not, they are attempting to ascend to the new ethic, and they need just to be trained. That's all it is. And of course, this gets scaled up to the organization. The organizations are doing this all over. They're marginalizing minority stakeholders and the environment in favor of short-term profits. So all of what is focused on and projected out are the kind of what we must attain, what we must gain, what our goals are. And all the skeletons in the closet, unless you're a really wonderful organization that's actually doing that, you're dumping into the seas, you're dumping into the rivers, you're certainly ignoring, the minority stakeholders and shareholders of the company, the staff, the community. That is the same dynamic ratcheted up to the organizational level. And of course, it gets scaled up to the world. And I can give you a million examples of it. But the end result is that many good intentioned people are still trying to change the world before changing themselves, right? Because all of this is within them. This particular old ethic dynamic is still within you. And if you attempt to heal the world or enact a conscious revolution in one domain or another, while this particular old ethic is active and functioning within your psyche, unconsciously, you will bring that very toxicity into your endeavors. And you will bring it by overreach, by marginalizing that which is needing most care. Or you will just simply burn yourself out in the process, repeating the entire old ethic. And so, yes, those individuals have it backwards because the psyche will repeat its discrepancies with fidelity at every increasingly complex stage. And the result is that we have a general consensus the world is broken and that we need to fix it, when really the deeper truth is that we are, quote unquote, broken in the old ethic, and that our world is simply a reflection of that. So there we have it. Until we inaugurate the new ethic of emotional processing within ourselves, like addressing those wounds in our couple and our family, we will continue to suppress, repress, project, and scapegoat. I hope that was a little bit clear. It was important for me to give you the largest perspective I can. And even though that particular presentation wasn't the most beautiful I've ever done in my life, I think you can get the point that I'm trying to make, that this work is much larger than simply egocentric healing and development. It's really about the planet and the environment. It's about organizations, it's about culture, and it is about not marginalizing the least among us, right? Which is what we've done forever. And it is a psychic reality, right? Because the inner child, the parts of us that are sheared off during trauma, those are the least among us. And these are archetypal phrases. We only make as much ground as our slowest. It's true at the individual level. It's true in the couple. It's true in the family. It's true in the organization. It's true in the world. And so I'm hoping that that can give you some renewed vigor as you consider your healing, that it's part of a much larger picture. Okay. Peace in. I'll see you in the next one.